Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm Courtney from the library, and I just have a couple housekeeping things. For those of you joining us on Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the chat at any point, and I will read them out loud when we get to a Q&A session. And we are also recording for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access station, and for the library's YouTube page, so you'll be able to rewatch and share this presentation. And now I'm going to introduce Marianica.
Hi, so I'm MJ from here at the Wayland Library, and I would say in the last 4 or 5 years I've gotten very excited about our local history collection, so I'm always looking for ways to kind of invite people into our local history. And since there was a warrant article for funding from the CPA, the Community Preservation Funds, this year, it just seemed like there would be heightened interest in Stonesbridge. And so what I did is I called Jane Sciacca, as I often do about historical things, and I said, well, I'm looking for a speaker about Stonesbridge. Do you know anyone? And she said, well, that would be my husband. And I honestly, I did not know that. So I was very excited about that. And he agreed to do it. And let's see, so Tom Sciacca is a retired engineer and a green energy entrepreneur, has been Wayland's representative to the River Stewardship Council for 25 years. He and Jane and their infant son moved to Wayland in 1970 when he immediately fell in love with the Sudbury River. So now, it's to you. Oh, you have that, so I can just probably turn this thing.
All right, so let me see if the technology. Does that work? Yes. Well, I will do that. Thank you. So, okay, so you know who I am, and when I was asked to do this, it immediately struck me that the timing overlaps with Riverfest, which is the annual celebration of the River Stewardship Council. We've been holding this since 2001 to promote and help people understand the wonders of our primary environmental resource in this town, which is the Sudbury River. So, in 1999, 29 miles of the Sudbury, Aspen, and Concord rivers were designated as wild and scenic by act of Congress under the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968, signed into law by President Bill Clinton. And as a part of the designation, the River Stewardship Council was formed, which is a mostly volunteer group consisting of representatives of all 8 of the riverside towns, from Framingham up to Billerica, and Oars and SVT, and there's some state reps, and of course reps from the National Park Service, because we operate under the National Park Service. It's a Park Service program. And the rivers are recognized for what are called outstandingly remarkable values, which is a term obviously made up by a lawyer. And in our case, there are 5. It's specific to each recognized river. And with us, there's 5: scenery, ecology, recreation, history, which is unusual. The first 3 are, pretty common to most wild and scenic rivers, I think. But history is much less common. And literature, which is unique. No other river in the country, and therefore in the world, is specifically recognized for literature. And that's because our rivers were the playground of Hawthorne, Emerson, the Alcotts, and most importantly, Henry David Thoreau, which I will get into more later. Stonesbridge is perhaps the only site on our rivers which exemplifies all 5 of these values. And just to start out with scenery, there was a book written about 1980 called A Conscious Stillness, subtitled Two Naturalists on Thoreau's Rivers. And the authors paddled the entire length of the Assabet and the Sudbury Rivers from Westboro, Cedar Swamp, up to Concord, and they chose Stone's Bridge as the most scenic spot on any of the rivers. They chose to make it their book cover. And here's a quote from right in the beginning of the book. The landmark of landmarks, the ruins of an old stone bridge that stood out in the sunshine like some weathered remnant of a Roman aqueduct. And one of the neighbors sent me a picture, actually only a few days ago, that reminds me of that quote. You can imagine that in the Italian countryside, carrying an old Roman aqueduct. So let's start looking at the context of the bridge. This is the Sciacca watershed. Again, the Assabet and the Sudbury start in Westboro over here in Cedar Swamp, which is roughly where 495 and the Mass Pike intersect. And the Assabet runs north here and then into Concord. The Sudbury runs east and into Ashland and then turns north and again winds up in Concord. And the Concord then runs up into the Merrimack River up here at Lowell. The wild and scenic sections are the ones in the dark green. And the colonists called them three separate rivers, and that again the Assabet and the Sudbury meet in Concord and form a different river, the Concord River. But the Native Americans were smarter, as are geologists. The river from Saxonville up to Billerica is one river, and the Native Americans called it the Musketaquid, which means something like grassy river, grass ground river, river of grass. It has the characteristics of a long, narrow lake. 25 miles, it only drops to 2 feet. And it has enormously wide floodplains, as much as a mile wide. In Wayland, as an example, in between Route 27 and Sherman's Bridge, there are areas where the floodplain is a mile wide. And that has pluses and minuses for the early colonists. Boston was founded, remember, in 1630. And about 1633, people were out exploring to the west from Boston. And they found these fields of green gold, or that's what it looked like to them. The economy of the early English colonists was based on cattle farming. And New England had a problem for people like that. New England was all forests, and cows don't like to eat trees. There were actually some early attempts at feeding the cows acorns. The cows didn't like acorns very much. But when they explored to the west of Boston, and they came upon these enormous hayfields, which is how they saw it, this was just wonderful. So 1635, Concord was founded. 1638, Sudbury was founded. And I hope everyone knows that when I say Sudbury, it is what we now call Wayland and Sudbury. Sudbury Plantation was the name of that original entity. So the river marshes were a tremendous asset. And the first town center, let's see, was at what we call now the North Cemetery, which is along old Sudbury Road over here. And that was a very logical place because if you stand up on the edge of the North Cemetery and look down, you're looking down on the river floodplain, which was again the center of their lives. It's where their cattle were. So, on the one hand, the characteristics of the river with the broad floodplain were an enormous asset. But in another way, it was a problem because half that asset was on the other side of the river. And to get over there, well, the way the Native Americans got over there and the colonists initially were at the fording places. And all of the spots that we now know as bridge sites were fording sites. Stones Bridge, Pelham Island Road Bridge, Route 20 Bridge, Old Town Bridge, Sherman's Bridge. All of them were spots where the river was shallow and they could wade across a lot of the time. Most of the time, probably. But not all the time. So they initially used little boats as ferries, but near the site of the original settlement, which was again over here, they built the first bridge over the river in Sudbury. Usually called the Old Town Bridge. So it was an obvious spot in that it was near where the people were. But it had some downsides. If you know the site, the ground is high on the eastern side, the Wayland side, but you cross over and you're into the river marsh. And you have to cross roughly a half mile of river marsh before you get to the high ground on the western side, what we now look at as the Sudbury side. And well, I was okay, probably most of the time, because the river marsh actually dried out very quickly in the spring in those days. That was pre the Billerica Dam, pre all the bridges being built across the river, but not all the time. So it was problematic. So the first bridge, Old Town Bridge, was 1642 or 3, And by the way, when we talk about old dates like this, you have to regard them as a bit approximate. The people were engaged in survival, and they had a limited amount of time to document everything in detail. But again, approximately 1642 or 3, they built the first incarnation of the Old Town Bridge. And that was fine for a few years, but again, occasionally there was a problem getting over the river. So a few years later, 1650 approximately, one site says 1649, they found another site over here, the site of what we call Stone's Bridge. And it had a couple of really interesting, it wasn't ideal in that it was miles away from where the people were at the time, but it had some interesting characteristics. If you look at the picture here, which is probably from early 20th century, but you can see that the land is high on both sides. And that's a distinct advantage. Once you get across on either end, you're home free. And the river is pretty narrow in here. This is it. That's the entire width of the river at this point. So relatively easy to build a bridge. So 1650 approximately, there's a horse bridge built there. The assumption is, and these are largely assumptions and read into the records, which only make a mention of a horse bridge, but it presumably means a bridge that's wide enough and strong enough for a horse, one horse. So that was adequate for roughly 25 years, but people from Sudbury, from the populated areas up here, started slowly filtering down this way and using the bridge. So 1674, a new one is built, a cart bridge, by a guy named Samuel Howe, who I think lived on the Framingham side, although that's a little unclear to me. But it's actually documented in the Framingham records and not in the Sudbury records, and it's called the first bridge in Framingham, which is interesting in regard to later events, but we'll talk about that in a while. So for 25 years, whenever you build transportation infrastructure, it attracts development. You build a new highway and you get towns and population and businesses growing up along it. Well, the new bridge encouraged the development of Saxonville and the advent of Framingham. Founded 25 years later, the first settlement of Framingham is Saxonville. That's where Framingham started. So I want to. And I should say also that from when it was built, and possibly even of the horse bridge, it was called the New Bridge. And it was a new bridge because the old bridge was the old Town Bridge, the first bridge. So this was the second one. It was the new one. Remained the new bridge for about 150 years. Even though in that interval, Sherman's Bridge was built and the Farm Bridge, which we now know as Pelham Island Road Bridge, that was built. But it was the new bridge until roughly 1825, plus or minus 20 years or so. And it became hugely important because it became the route of the county road. It was a main drag. You leave Boston, you head west. You want to go west. You get to what we now know as the Wayland Western Line. It was the Sudbury Watertown line at the time, and you have a choice. You can head either north up Plain Road and then ultimately over the Old Town Bridge, or you can head south down what we now know as Old Connecticut Path, and what at the time was called the South County Path, I believe. So it was the main drag. Now we look at the bridge as it is now and the road as it is now. Clearly, it's not a main road now, but it was then. So let me make one other comment at this point. It was made of wood, as were all bridges initially. And the life of a wooden bridge is 15 to 30 years, maybe, at that time. Remember, they weren't made of pressure-treated lumber. You know, this was just what they chopped out of the trees. And these weren't covered bridges, which were a way that later builders had to protect the wood. These were exposed. And so they would rot out and they would need constant repair, and 15 to 30 years is about the max you got out of one prior to a major rebuilding. Now I want to skip ahead a little bit, about 100 years. Remember, the bridge was built 1674. 1775, Boston Harbor is occupied by the British, and George Washington needs a way to get him out of there. And he hears about all these old leftover cannon out at Fort Ticonderoga, left over from the French and Indian War. And the colonists, Americans, now had possession of Ticonderoga. So he got Henry Knox to drag, I think I remember 62 cannon from the fort to ultimately Dorchester Heights, where they could set up over the harbor and scare the hell out of the British and to get them out of there. So this is a shot of my co-conspirator here at Fort Ticonderoga, and the two remaining cannon of that episode. The one on the right there is actually one that made it into Boston and, of course, ultimately back to Ticonderoga. But that specific one was dragged up Old Connecticut Path, which is almost past our house. We're on Rolling Lane, just off Old Con Path. The one on the left is out of the total population, but that actually fell in the Hudson River through the ice on the way, and I think only got retrieved something like 75 years later, a long time later. So for many years, the story was told that they were dragged over Stone's Bridge. And a lot of the rationale was that Stone's Bridge had been rebuilt in stone, and that the structure that we now see the remnants of was from 1722. That's what the story was, and that it was the strongest bridge on the river because it was built out of stone at the time. So that was a lot of the reason why the assumption was that it was actually the root of the canon. Helen Emery, who many of us remember as a giant of the Wayland historical community, put many years of her life into researching this, and concluded that it wasn't true. That the bridge was absolutely not built of stone in 1722. But if it had been, by the way, it would be enormously significant. It would make it the oldest stone bridge in the state. But her conclusion was that she found records of bridges built in 1746, 71, and later, but wooden bridges. Absolutely not a stone bridge at that point. So the issue now is was it the likely root of Knox's canon? Well, no, it wasn't stone. However, her research found that the 1771 rebuilding was especially strong. It was unusually strong. So that raises the possibility that still it was the strongest one on the river, and therefore the reasonable way to drag the canon. And the other fact here is that it was the main road. It was the South County Road. So any other route would have been off the beaten path. So I don't think it can ever be proved one way or the other. Apparently Knox didn't document his exact path from Framingham to Cambridge, but I think it's at least reasonable that it is in fact the case. So that leaves open the question of when was the stone structure that we're now looking at built? And Helen nailed it down to the late 19th century, but couldn't really nail it any more than that until the authors of A Conscious Stillness found this entry in Thoreau's journal. Now I should explain. You asked 99 people out of 100 what body of water they associate with Henry David Thoreau, and they'll say, well, Walden Pond, of course. Well, the fact of the matter is he only spent a couple of years on Walden Pond. He spent essentially his entire life on the Sudbury River. He lived on the river, and he was out on it like every other day. And he would paddle, he would sail, he would hike up and down the river. He would ice skate. He specifically said the quickest way to get up to Wayland on the river is by ice skating. And he would visit Wayland often. And in this instance, he never got past the Oxbow, which if anybody wants to ask me questions later, I'll explain, but it's roughly on the Wayland-Framingham line. And in 1859, he got to the Oxbow, and he found this interesting new structure there, and he chatted with somebody who was fishing, I think, on the river, and they told him about the bridge and that it had been built a couple of years earlier, and he told the author of The Conscious Stillness told Helen Emery about that, and describes her as almost jumping up and down with excitement. Now, any of us who knew Helen can't really imagine her jumping up and down, but she was obviously pretty excited. And it turned out after this point, Helen started working with some Framingham people, and they found a record in the Framingham archives of Framingham having paid for at least a part of this new structure, which is again interesting in light of what's happened more recently. There's a little bit of mystery as to why there's no record of it in the Wayland archives. Helen, I think, speculated that that money was used, which was diverted from a settlement with Boston over the Cochituate diversions for Boston water supply. And again, if anybody wants to hear more about that, ask me in Q&A. So anyway, we have nailed now the construction of the stone incarnation of the bridge, which is what we're now looking at the remains of, to 1857 or 58. So just a few, one interesting pic of what it looked like. This is we don't have a date on this, but it's probably about the turn of the 20th century, from the fact that it's a horse being driven across and not a motor vehicle. So the view here is from the Framingham side, and the river flow is here. And again, notice the land is high on both sides. And all of that becomes relevant when I show you this. 1955, some of us are old enough to remember the 50s, and that they were a time of lots of hurricanes. I see some smiles here. We were pretty young in those days, but I still remember those. And a couple of them were in 1955. There was Carol, and then 3 days later there was Diane. And by the way, I've documented elsewhere that all of the worst flooding issues have occurred not as a result of one big storm, but of multiple storms happening a few days or maybe weeks apart. And that's a major weakness, by the way, of the way the state looks at stormwater. They look at it only in terms of 24-hour precip events. The reality is that's not what matters. What matters is what happens over days and weeks. That's the particular hobby horse of mine. But anyway, again, Carol, 3 days later, Diane. And now this is a shot of the bridge pre-Diane. And notice again, it's high on both sides, and notice how narrow the river channel is. So, to the river, that's not really a bridge. It's actually a dam with 4 culverts under it, with obviously a very limited capacity. So this wall of water comes down from Framingham and encounters the dam, and only a little of it can squeeze under the culverts, so it goes over. And in the process of going over, it completely wipes out the roadbed, the top. So this is from the Boston Globe, by the way, of November '55. And if you look at the headline, it's obvious the state's response immediately is to take it down. And but let's see, let's go to this one. This is what they put in place temporarily, a Bailey Bridge over the Overstones Bridge, which is still, not actually there. A Bailey Bridge, I think they were invented in World War II by the Army Corps to enable troops to quickly cross rivers and streams, but are used, even recently. We had one over the Pelham Island Road Bridge about 20 years ago for a while. So anyway, the state wanted to just rip it down. But then they encountered the Wayland Historical Society. The Wayland Historical Society was founded in 1954, so it had kind of that newbie energy. And a leading light at the time was Margaret Bent Morrow, who started writing letters to the Boston papers about how incredibly valuable this historic structure is. And of course, they were telling the story of Knox's Cannon at the time and of the 1722, and so the facts are really irrelevant. What was relevant was the publicity campaign. So she was quickly joined by the Framingham Historical Society. This is a bridge in between Wayland and Framingham. And so Framingham Historical Society, 2 separate chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution got involved in this. And then, town officials started climbing on the bandwagon, and in I think both towns. And a state rep, a guy named de Normandy, lived in Lincoln, but he took this on. And anyway, the bottom line is money was made available, and legislation was made available to salvage it as a historic monument. So here's a shot from 1961. They remember the western end of it was here, all 4 arches here. The bank in Framingham was here. Well, they tugged the channel out on the western side. By the way, I should mention, people look at it as it stands, and often make an assumption that a western arch was washed out, which is wrong. There never was a western arch. That's even in Wayland A to Z, and it's even kind of implied in A Conscious Stillness. But it's not true. Again, the bridge damage was washing over the top, washing out the entire roadbed, the top structure, and it was the later project that dug the channel out on the western side, and on the end here, they built a new wall, concrete and steel, under that, faced with stone to make it look more or less like the historic stone. And I don't have a date on this, but it looks like it's not long after it was done. Just to give you more of an idea of what the whole project was about, number one, they built a new road, which we now know as Stonebridge Road, across the river marshes. All of this was river marsh. They built a causeway across the marsh, a new bridge over here, which is the one that we drive over now. Now, if you look at this, by the way, is a Google screenshot from like a week ago. This is modern stuff. But the river channel went perpendicular to the old bridge. It was like this, and the river went around like that. And in fact, this little area over here is a remnant of the original river. There are stone bounds right here showing the Wayland Framingham town line. The town line went right through the middle of the old bridge, which was the middle of the river channel. And again, follow the channel. Around this way. So that the new bridge here is entirely in Framingham. Some of you may remember I sponsored a town meeting article a couple of years ago to recognize that and make Framingham pay for their own damn bridge. Because Framingham is not helping to pay for the restoration of Stones Bridge. So here's an interesting shot from the 70s when likely another hurricane, showing that the project worked in terms of opening up the flow around to the west of the old bridge. And here's a shot of many that show how wonderfully scenic the bridge is. And yet another one. So 1957 to roughly the turn of the century, maintenance of the bridge was accomplished by the neighbors, basically. Any of you who have worked with the state and state projects will probably recognize the common pattern of the state spending large amounts of money on construction projects, but allocating absolutely nothing for maintenance. And that was the case here. The neighbors took it on, And now this is a recent picture, but just an idea of the neighbors doing the work, the grassroots effort. So that worked until roughly the turn of the century. For some reason at that point they stopped maintaining the bridge. There's a story about why, which I'm not going to repeat because I can't document it, but if anybody firsthand knows what I'm talking about, again, chime in during Q&A. Sometime around 2010, remember the River Council had been formed in 1999 along with the Wild and Scenic designation. So around 2010, my Framingham colleague on the River Council came to me and said, you know, Tom, we have a real problem over at Stone's Bridge. Stuff is piling up against it and, you know, maybe going to compromise the structure, and stuff is growing out of it, and we got to do something about that. And ironic that this was initiated by a Framingham guy. But I agreed, and we started working on it. The first thing we did was we got the River Council to make a small grant to the town of Wayland to clean it up. Nobody in Wayland wanted to use the money. There was no town entity that wanted to step up and use it. Eventually, a couple of civic-minded citizens, Mike Lowry and John Derrick, stepped up, found a local contractor, hired them, whipped out their credit cards, and paid them. I think they were eventually reimbursed by the town. I hope they were. But again, if either of them are listening and wants to call in and confirm that, they can do that. You know, that helped for, I don't know, a year or two, but it became clear that the bridge needed a lot more than just a cleanup. So Bill and I started meeting with various entities in both towns, Wayland and Framingham. But for example, when we met with the DPW, the response was, well, it's not our department. It's not actually a bridge. It won't carry any cars or anything, you know. I should mention that was a previous administration to the one we have now at the DPW. And Framingham was just not interested. You know, their response was, it won't even connect to Framingham. Why should we care? Eventually, however, we found the Wayland Historical Commission. Now, I know a lot of people have trouble differentiating. There's the Historical Society, which is a private entity that runs the Grout Herd House, the Wayland Museum. And there's the Historic District Commission that regulates how you can renovate the outside of your house in a historic district. And then there's the Historical Commission, which is a town board and is responsible for historic resources in the town. And the Historic Commission recognized this as a valuable historic resource that they ought to take responsibility for. So they took it on, went to the CPC, And in 2015, we at town meeting appropriated $480,000 to. It was meant to renovate the two Wayland arches. You know, at the time, everybody was recognizing, yeah, this is half in Wayland and half in Framingham, and we should be responsible for the Wayland half, so let's appropriate enough money to do the Wayland side, and maybe Framingham will step up, and, you know, once they see what we've done, and, you know, to take care of the other half. They got an engineer out there to look at it who basically said it made no sense to try to work on only half of it. You know, these are arched structures, dry laid stone. You know, there's nothing holding it together other than gravity and the compression strength of stone. It just wasn't reasonable to only do half the bridge. So, 2019, they came back to town meeting for an additional appropriation of another $300,000. At that point, that they were saying, you know, whatever Framingham wants to do, we want it fixed. And, you know, if Wayland has to pay for all of it, well, so be it. And unfortunately, there were a number of issues at that point, contracting issues, flooding issues. In order to do the job, you really need low water. And we've had several years where the river never went down at the end of summer the way it's supposed to. You know? Anyway, this spring, they came back again to town meeting for another appropriation. This one was another $400,000. Which is enough to finish the job. And I just got this yesterday from Abby Shute, who is our wonderful new sustainability manager in town. Not so new. She's been there more than a year, I think, now. But at any rate, the town has executed a contract with a vendor, has gotten all the permits. Kickoff meeting was last Wednesday, a week ago Wednesday. And there are some final steps for the contractor, but she's projecting work will start in about 2 weeks. And equally important, the level of the river has gone down. It was high earlier in the spring, but it's now down. So if we don't get another big storm or hurricane or something like that, this is looking really good. After 15 years, looks like it will actually get done. Okay, with that, I will open it up to questions. Yeah, I don't know if you're allowed, but yeah, you can go.
Well, I've heard so many incarnations of this talk, but I don't remember you saying tonight, explaining Stone's Bridge. You've never mentioned the Stone.
Oh, I never mentioned that tonight. Yes, right, because,
So I think we
of course,
should
I've
add
explained
it.
this a gazillion times in a gazillion forums, but yes. The name Stone's Bridge, many people hear the name Stone's Bridge and look at the bridge and they say, well, obviously it was because it's made of stone. But no, nothing to do with it. The land around the bridge, especially on the Wayland side, was owned by members of the Stone family. And in fact, the way the name evolved, again, initially it was called New Bridge for around 150 years. And sometime around 1825, people started to call it the bridge over by Aaron Stone's. And that got shortened to Stone's Bridge. And it's remained that ever since. Steve?
Could you say a few words about the redirecting of the road? Because the picture you showed of the long view across the bridge, and now what's there, you know, the whole neighborhood is grown up on both sides.
Yeah. So on the Wayland side, around the turn of the 20th century, that developed into a resort area. Probably most of us know the name Riverview, but it's where Boston people came out to to their summer cottages. Playground, again, the river was swimmable. It actually still is, but not officially. But by the way, I'll take the luxury of having the microphone to say, a lot of people have the misconception that the river is polluted and dirty because there are all these signs up there. Don't eat the fish. No, the river is actually pretty clean. It has one issue, which is mercury, which is an issue not in the water, it's in the fish. So, no, you can't eat the fish that you catch in the river, but other than that, the water's really pretty high quality. So anyway, and it was the turn of the 20th century. So Riverview is this whole neighborhood over here. There was, by the way, a house here which the Wayland Concom bought and ripped down, and I think that was part of the 2015 appropriation. And it's a beautiful little park there now. This whole area looks to turn into one of the most gorgeous corners of Wayland when we get through with the bridge here. So yeah, this area was a resort community. A lot of the houses now have been winterized, but on the other side, Framingham, after the redevelopment of the bridge here, the area on that side, the road went over this way, and the whole area here was sold for development in the 60s. So it's now the houses you see there.
Just a comment,
Courtney.
I believe, from your neighbor, the Stone family's original home has been beautifully restored right across Old Stone Bridge Road.
I did not know that. Thank you.
Can you repeat that? Sorry, the Stone family's original home has been beautifully restored right across Old Stone Bridge Road.
Okay. One of the great benefits of a talk like this is I learn an enormous amount in the course of developing it, even right up to delivering it. Any other questions? Yeah.
We just want to clarify, is that the house on the north side, right where the roads diverge, the old road and the one over the current bridge?
I'll ask him.
Yes.
Could you repeat the question, because some of us can't hear very well?
He's asking which house it is that was rebuilt, and I don't know. The ones right near it here are early 20th century. So yeah, it might be the one right where the road diverges. Tom?
When this restoration is complete, does that mean that we can go out and walk out onto a new roadway, a nice roadway? And,
I'm assuming that. Yeah, I didn't explain. The goal of the restoration originally was to create a platform for fishing, bird watching. You know about fishing, bird watching, picnicking, just hanging out there, and grokking over the river. So yeah, you ought to be able to walk out there. Yeah.
But the bridge won't be connected to the Framingham side.
No, there's now actually a house right on the other side. Yeah. Courtney.
Maybe you've answered this in other forms, but does it take a special skill to fix this kind of bridge with no mortar and all that?
My understanding is, yeah, the contractors are specialty. Gretchen might know more about this. They're specialty contractors with special skills.
Historic structures.
Yeah, okay,
Historic structures.
right.
It's like dry laid stone walls. Same idea.
okay.
You get somebody who knows how to do dry laid walls.
I was
Listen.
curious about the muscle study that was done for the permitting process.
Yeah. So yeah, let me go back a little ways. I originally said. When I laid out the 5 ORVs, ecology is the one of our ORVs, and for the rivers as a whole, you can certainly look at the fact that almost all of our wild and scenic designation overlaps with the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. And that is in general wonderful wildlife habitat. It's a stop on the Atlantic Flyway. All those birds migrating from the Arctic to the tropics, they have to rest and eat someplace. Well, this is one of the places. And it's also where there's, I think, something like 4, not endangered, they're not quite at that level, but there are other levels of rare, threatened creatures in these rivers. So about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, the River Council hired a mussel expert, an expert on freshwater mussels. And if any of you are into Thoreau, it's what he called clams. But freshwater mussels are all over in our river. I actually caught one on a hook and line once many years ago. Fought like hell, I'll tell you. But we hired a guy to inventory the freshwater mussel population, and he found lots of them from Saxonville, basically to the bridge and a bit beyond. And I think 2 of them were again threatened, rare. You may know these categories better than I do. But anyway, ones that need protection. It was an issue in the permitting of the bridge, so they hired Ethan to look at this again. This is kind of an esoteric expertise, and there's like one guy in the state who's really an expert in this stuff. And yeah, he went out there and looked. He found exactly 1 mussel, and it was relocated. So it's no longer an issue. Tanya?
Just a note on was where the Emerson Hospital parking lot was.
Right.
Back in the earlier part of the century, not this century, last century. A lot of avocational archaeologists went there and excavated a shelving made up of these mussels. And Harvard has a couple of the original mussels. So they made it into the collection.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, historically they were all over the rivers. Again, Thoreau talked about them a lot. And he talked about how the muskrats would float down the river with the clams on their belly as they were munching on them. But again, what we found especially interesting was there are a couple of the species that there are like a half a dozen species in the area, in this area of the river, and a couple of them are again rare enough to be protected. Okay.
Bill Ricka Dam, how did that affect the Sudbury as far down as Stones Bridge? Or maybe it didn't affect it, I don't know.
So let's see. Look at this crowd. I'm betting that almost everybody knows about the Bill Ricka Dam and its effects. So the low water impoundment effect of the dam and the Fordway Bar, which at this point actually has about an equal effect, ends about where Wayland High School and Hurd's Pond are kind of across from each other. So they don't get, which is about halfway from like Pelham Island Road to Stones Bridge. So normally, for example, when the water is really low at the end of the summer, and if you go out on the Stonebridge Road bridge, the modern bridge, and you look down, there's not a lot of water there. And the reason is because it's above that impoundment effect. But whereas if you're down at Route 20, for example, or Pelham Island Road, there's still, the water's obviously much lower than it usually is, but there's still 5 feet of water under you at that point. Again, that's that impoundment effect from the dam and the Fordway Bar. By the way, and this isn't on topic exactly, but hopefully everybody knows or will soon know or hear about the fact that the Bill Ricka Dam looks like it's going to be taken down next year, after 300 years. And for those of us who are into the river, that's a pretty exciting thing. Gretchen?
Would you just comment about how the Scenic River group feels about that dam coming down?
Oh, we've been advocating for it for years. And in fact, every environmental organization, environmental group, local, regional, state, federal, has been advocating for that for forever. It's been a long slog because the owner of that dam, who only owns it because like his great-great-great-grandfather owned it, he didn't want it either, but he doesn't want to spend any money on it. But because of what Joe Biden did with the Infrastructure Act and making money available for worthwhile projects, that's what's being used basically to fund the removal of that dam. So pretty much everyone other than Bill Ricca and the immediate neighbors are very happy with this. And the last I heard was the Bill Ricca aunties are backing off, basically. But it's going to happen no matter what, because all of the evaluations are that it's a good thing. Tom?
When the dam goes, having nothing to do with the bridge, of course, but of course there was a meadow several hundred years ago, and now it's mostly bush and lots of other things. I conjecture as to how the ecology might change.
I need to sit down because I'm almost Joe Biden's age, and my age is starting to show. What I've heard is that it's not likely to revert to what it was 300 years ago. There's just too much inertia in the ecology, which is there now. But it's presumably everybody has at least heard that there were huge controversies over the dam for hundreds of years, literally starting in 1710 when it was originally built, but really accelerating in the 19th century when they raised the dam to supply the Middlesex Canal. And Wayland and Sudbury farmers were in court over and over with the Bill Ricca Dam owners and the Middlesex Canal owners. And this went to the state legislature, and it went back and forth. Bills were passed to remove the dam, and then a year later, the bill was passed to say, never mind, we didn't really mean it, something like that. So there have been conflicts between the Wayland and Sudbury and Concord and Bedford farmers and the dam owners for literally hundreds of years. And the rationale was that the dam was screwing up the river marshes. But the ecology of the river marshes are now completely different from what they were hundreds of years ago. So I don't think it's clear to anybody what will evolve as the water drops a little bit. It's also not totally clear how much the water is going to drop. The official engineering evaluation claimed it would only drop upstream of Concord by 3.6 inches, they said. As an engineer, anytime I hear a number that's that precise, I know there's a lot of BS there. But there's a whole nother dimension to why the water up this way is as high as it is, especially in flood times, which is all of the bridges and the bars and the obstructions across the river which have been built since colonial times. And Thoreau found that when he was very much involved in the evaluation of all this in the 1850s. And I've actually been working on this issue with the Wayland DPW lately. There's no question that, for example, the railroad trestle that was built in Wayland in 1880 is an obstruction. The issue is how much of an obstruction is. I have videos of when we had the higher water, I think it was last winter, and how it was obviously obstructed by the trestle. The question is how much. But even if each obstruction only raises the water behind it by an inch, there are something like 25 of them from here to Billerica. So, add all those up and it becomes significant. So I think the answer to Tom is no one knows what's going to happen to that ecology.
I just want to put in a plug to learn more about this. You could go on the history panel.
Yes, we have, sure. This, as I started out, this event tonight is a part of Riverfest. Hopefully you've all seen the flyers. If not, they have them upstairs in the main room in the library. There are
Is it exhibit?
where there's also an exhibit. And we have 2 other Wayland events coming up. Tomorrow night is the photo walk at her Herd Farm with Hendrik Brookman, who some of you probably know. He's an expert local photographer. And by the way, if any of you have not walked around Herd Farm recently, it is worth an evening of your time. The Concom has done a phenomenal job on all of its properties, I think, in town, but Herd Farm, I think, in particular, is gorgeous. And then at the end of the month, I think maybe the 27th, we have the History Paddle, which is an event we've done for 20 odd years now, with Brandeis Professor Emeritus of History, Brian Donahue. And we launch at Route 20 and we paddle up to Sherman's Bridge, and we stop every once in a while for Brian to tell us about the history of the river and the history of these controversies over the dam and over the marshes. And it's like a graduate seminar on the water. And if any of you have missed one of the highlights of Wayland and have not actually been out on the river, this is a good excuse. Everyone who gets out there thinks it is absolutely gorgeous. I've never heard an exception to that.
Also putting a plug for the Middlesex Canal Museum in Billerica, which is a surprisingly very cool museum. And you learn a lot about the Sudbury River and about the Middlesex Canal when it existed. And it's open weekends throughout the year, and definitely throughout the summer, and it's free.
I'm suspecting MJ went upstairs to get some copies of the flyers. She has something in her hand, so yes. Gretchen?
Just a little factoid that the Old Town Bridge off Old Sudbury Road was listed in the National Register because everybody thought it was much older than it is. And then it got delisted when they found out that it was in fact totally reconstructed in 1903. But Stones Bridge is listed in the National Register.
Okay, MJ, I'm suspecting you have some flyers to
Well, I just thought if
give
you
out.
want one on the back table over here,
Ah.
I'd like to.
Don't even have to climb the stairs. No excuse to get. Yeah, there are. I talked about the Wayland events, but there are wonderful events up and down the rivers, from again Framingham up to Billerica. I think there's a tour of Saxonville and its historic resources.
Yeah,
Very.
unfortunately, that was canceled because of heat and
Oh.
yeah, so it was all sunny, over 90 degrees. So
Okay. We've had Riverfest every year since 2001. So like the Red Sox, if you don't see it this year, wait till next year. Anything online?